what does happiness really look like? For James, it used to mean business deals, success, and a life in the city. But today, he's sitting beside a quiet mountain stream with Diep, sharing simple food, laughing like children, and discovering something he never noticed before. Because sometimes the life we chase for years is not the life that actually makes us happy. And today, James may finally understand what truly matters. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Lie to Diep VN. In today's episode, James decides to take a break from work in the garden and brings Diep to a peaceful mountain stream for a simple picnic. Away from the busy world, they share quiet moments together, laugh like old friends, and begin talking about what kind of future they truly want. Sometimes the most beautiful memories are not made in big cities or grand places, but in small, quiet moments we share with someone we love. Before we continue, if you enjoy warm and heartfelt stories like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're on our way to 1,000 subscribers, and your support truly means the world to us. Now, let's continue the story. The morning sunlight slipped quietly across the bamboo grove behind the house, warming the small yard where the garden had begun to take shape. The rows of soil James and Diep had prepared the day before were still dark from the cool night air. The small bamboo fence stood around them like a gentle promise that something new would grow there soon. James stood beside the garden, stretching his back slowly. He had already watered the soil and checked the bamboo fence twice. Satisfied, he placed the watering can down and looked toward the mountains. The sky was clear, not a single dark cloud, just bright blue stretching endlessly across the hills. Behind him, the back door opened. Diep stepped outside, brushing a few loose strands of hair behind her ear. "You're already working again?" she asked. James turned and smiled, just checking the garden. Diep walked closer and looked down at the rows of soil. "It's still the same as yesterday," she said. James shrugged. "I wanted to make sure everything was okay." Diep folded her arms. "You're starting to behave like a real farmer." James pretended to think about that. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment or an insult." Diep smirked. "That depends on how your plants grow." James looked at the garden again. "They will grow." Diep raised an eyebrow. "You sound very confident." James turned toward the mountains again. "Because today, I'm not working." Diep blinked. "What?" James picked up a small woven basket from the porch. "Today," he said, "we take a break." Diep frowned slightly. "A break?" "Yes. You never take breaks." James nodded. "That's exactly the problem." Diep studied him suspiciously. "What are you planning?" James opened the basket. Inside were several small containers of food. Rice, grilled bamboo shoots, fresh cucumbers, a few pieces of fruit. Diep's eyes widened. "You prepared all of this?" James shrugged. "I had help from the kitchen." "You mean you didn't burn anything?" "Very funny." Diep laughed softly. "So where are we going?" James pointed toward the mountains behind the bamboo grove. "The stream." Diep paused. "The mountain stream?" "Yes." She looked at the basket again, then at James. "You're serious?" James nodded. "Very." Diep hesitated only a moment before smiling. "All right." The narrow path through the bamboo forest felt cool and peaceful. Sunlight filtered gently through the tall green stalks, creating dancing patterns across the ground as the wind moved the leaves above. James walked ahead, carrying the basket over his shoulder. Behind him, Diep followed at an easy pace. "You know," she said after a moment, "I haven't been to the stream in months." James glanced back. Why not? Too busy. With what? Diep smiled faintly. Life. James nodded quietly. That answer made sense, because before all of this, life had been filled with things that never seemed to stop. Work, problems, worries. But today felt different. The bamboo forest slowly opened into a small clearing where the mountain stream flowed between smooth gray stones. The water was clear and cool, gliding gently over the rocks with a soft, constant sound. James set the basket down beside a flat stone. Perfect spot, he said. Diep stepped closer to the water. She crouched and dipped her fingers into the stream. Still freezing, she said. James laughed. That's mountain water. Diep splashed a little water toward him. You should try it. James stepped closer and crouched beside her. He touched the water carefully, then pulled his hand back immediately. Okay, he said. That is definitely freezing. Diep laughed. You're the one who suggested the stream. James stood and stretched his arms. That's because this place is beautiful. And it was. The clearing felt quiet and hidden from the rest of the world. Tall trees surrounded the stream, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Sunlight reflected off the moving water, scattering small flashes of light across the rocks. Diep sat on the flat stone beside the basket. So this is your big plan? James sat beside her. Yes. She looked around. And what exactly are we supposed to do? James opened the basket and began placing the food on a cloth. We eat. Diep smiled. That's your entire plan? James nodded. Simple plans are the best plans. They sat together beside the stream, eating quietly for a while. The grilled bamboo shoots were warm and slightly smoky. The cucumbers were crisp and fresh. Even the rice tasted better in the open air. After a few minutes, James leaned back on his hands and looked up at the sky through the trees. You know something? He said. Diep glanced at him. What? James watched the sunlight shifting through the leaves. I used to think I needed a big life. Diep raised an eyebrow. A big life? Yes. He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. Big business. Big success. Big goals. Diep waited. And now? She asked. James looked at the small stream flowing beside them. The basket of simple food, the quiet forest, and Diep sitting beside him. Now I think I was wrong. Diep tilted her head slightly. How? James smiled softly. Because this feels bigger. The stream continued flowing gently beside them. And for the first time in a long while, the world felt completely still. The soft sound of water continued flowing through the quiet clearing as the afternoon slowly moved forward. The small picnic cloth beside the stream was now almost empty. Only a few pieces of fruit remained in the basket, and the sunlight above the trees had begun turning warmer, softer, the way it did when the day slowly leaned toward evening. James leaned back on his elbows, watching the moving water. Diep sat beside him, her feet resting on one of the smooth stones near the stream. For a while, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt comfortable, peaceful. Then suddenly, splash! Cold water hit James's arm. He jumped slightly and turned toward Diep. She was trying very hard not to laugh. You did that on purpose? He said. Diep lifted her hands innocently. The water moved. James narrowed his eyes. The water moved directly onto my arm? Diep shrugged. Maybe the stream likes you. James leaned closer to the water again. Oh, really? He dipped both hands into the freezing stream. Diep immediately realized what he was about to do. James, don't. Too late. Splash! Cold water flew toward her. Diep gasped as droplets landed across her sleeve. James? He grinned like a child who had just discovered a new game. You started it. Diep looked at the stream, then at James, then slowly dipped her hands into the water again. Oh, so that's how we're playing? James suddenly looked less confident. Wait, another splash flew through the air. James laughed and stepped back quickly, but the edge of his shoe slipped on one of the wet stones. He barely caught his balance. Careful, Diep said between laughs. You're the one who started this battle. James wiped water from his sleeve. You're surprisingly competitive. Diep sat back on the stone again, smiling. You have no idea. The playful moments slowly faded as both of them returned to sitting beside the stream. The breeze moved gently through the trees, carrying the soft rustle of leaves above them. James stretched his legs out toward the water. You know, he said thoughtfully, I haven't laughed like that in a long time. Diep glanced at him. Really? James nodded slowly. In the city, everything always felt urgent. He picked up a small pebble and tossed it into the stream. Meetings, deadlines, problems. Diep watched the ripple spread across the water. And now? She asked quietly. James looked around the clearing again. The quiet forest, the clear water, the sunlight filtering through the leaves. And now, he said softly, everything feels slower. Diep leaned slightly against the rock beside her. That's because village life moves differently. James smiled. I think I like it. They sat quietly for another moment. Then James turned toward her. Diep. She looked at him. Yes? James hesitated slightly before speaking. Have you ever thought about staying here like this? Diep tilted her head. Staying here? Yes. He gestured gently around them. The house, the garden, the mountains, all of it. Diep looked toward the small stream again. The water continued flowing calmly over the rocks. I used to think I would leave this place someday, she admitted. James listened carefully. But now? He asked. Diep smiled faintly. Now I'm not so sure. James leaned back slightly, resting his hands behind him. Good. Diep raised an eyebrow. Why good? James looked toward the mountains. Because I'm starting to imagine something. Diep waited. James pointed toward the forest path behind them. A bigger garden. Diep laughed. You're already expanding the farm? Of course. And what else? James thought for a moment. Maybe a small wooden bench near the garden. So you can sit and admire your vegetables? Exactly. Diep shook her head. You're ridiculous. But there was warmth in her voice. James looked back toward the stream. And maybe someday, he added quietly, a few fruit trees. Diep leaned forward slightly. Fruit trees? Yes. Mango. Papaya. Maybe even oranges. Diep smiled softly. That sounds like a lot of work. James shrugged. I don't mind. Diep studied his face for a moment. You really mean it, she said. What? This life. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up another small stone and rolled it between his fingers. I spent a long time chasing things I thought mattered, he said slowly. Diep remained silent. But lately, he continued, I'm starting to understand something. He tossed the stone into the stream. What? James looked at her again. Peace is worth more than success. Diep didn't reply right away. But something in her expression softened, because the man sitting beside her now was very different from the man who once lived surrounded by business meetings and city lights. The sun had begun dipping lower behind the trees. Golden light spread across the clearing, turning the water into moving streaks of amber. James stood slowly and stretched. We should head back before it gets dark. Diep nodded and helped pack the remaining things into the basket. Before leaving, she took one last look at the stream. "Thank you," she said quietly. James paused. "For what?" Diep gestured toward the clearing. "For today." James smiled. Simple plans work. They began walking back along the narrow path through the bamboo forest. The sky above the mountains slowly deepened into shades of orange and soft purple. Behind them, the stream continued flowing quietly through the stones. And somewhere in that quiet mountain valley, two people were beginning to discover something far more valuable than success: a peaceful life. Together.